will go over the positive proposal of cognitive value that Perry's discussion suggests. And I will also discuss how this proposal helps defend or elaborate direct reference theory. So Perry's discussion suggests that the linguistic role of an indexical helps explain the cognitive value of its tokens. So recall premise 4 of Perry's argument, which was that the cognitive value of a word like today, the cognitive value of its tokens does not vary from utterance to utterance. Rather, the cognitive value is simply the role of the word type that today has. So, for instance, the role of the word type today is that an utterance of today refers to the day on which it's uttered. And this role is a kind of general linguistic rule that you'd find, for instance, in the dictionary as the meaning of today. So it's a constant meaning that the word type today has that helps determine the meaning of its tokens. So again, Perry suggests that the cognitive value that these words have can be explained by their role. So Perry takes the upshot of his argument, criticizing the unity of Frege sense, to be that we have to distinguish what helps explain cognitive value from what determines truth or falsity. So again, for him, what helps explain cognitive value is the role. But the role of such an expression, of a context-sensitive expression, does not determine its truth or falsity. It simply determines what its meaning is on particular occasions. So this distinction, i.e., arguing that we have to distinguish the thing that explains cognitive value from what determines truth or falsity, that distinction is in line with direct reference theory. For we can say that a token of a sentence has as its meaning, sorry, that's a typo. So let me reread this. We can say that a token of a sentence has as its meaning simply a Russellian proposition made up of the reference of the constituent tokens in context. So this Russellian proposition will determine the truth or falsity of the token sentence. However, or further, to explain the cognitive value of that token sentence, instead of appealing to this Russellian proposition, we can instead appeal to the linguistic role that the word types have. So, an utterance or a token of a sentence will express a Russellian proposition made up simply of the objects and properties or the reference of the expressions that have been tokened in that sentence. And then to explain the cognitive value or the epistemic upshot of that sentence in context, we won't appeal to this Russellian proposition, we'll appeal to the roles of the word tokens of the sentence. So to unpack some more how this proposal is supposed to work, Perry says that the roles of different word types provide different ways of apprehending possibly one and the same proposition, or similar ways of apprehending different propositions. So this idea of distinguishing the proposition and the way of apprehending it provided by roles can be made clear by considering a couple examples. So one example is Perry's case of David Hume and someone named Heimsen. So Heimsen is an individual living now, let's say, who is confused, and for some reason Heimsen thinks that he himself is David Hume. Okay, so this person Heimsen is very deluded about his own identity and thinks that he himself is a famous philosopher. And particularly, he thinks that he is David Hume. So now consider when each of Hume and Heimsen utter the following sentences. So 4a, I am the author of the treatise. So the treatise is a shorthand for Hume's magnum opus. Okay, so David Hume himself is the author of the treatise. So when Hume says 4a, I am the author of the treatise, he is saying something true. And the Russellian proposition that Hume's token of 4a expresses is a proposition containing Hume himself and the property of being the author of the treatise. And that proposition is true because the object Hume is in fact the author of the treatise. Now, when Heimsen says 4a, I am the author of the treatise, Heimsen is saying something false. Okay, because Heimsen is not Hume. Heimsen is deluded. Now, the Russellian proposition expressed by Heimsen's token of 4a is a proposition containing Heimsen, because when Heimsen says the word I picks out Heimsen himself, because Heimsen is a speaker. So what that means is that when Heimsen says 4a, when he tokens I am the author of the treatise, the Russellian proposition he expresses contains him himself, Heimsen, and the property of being the author of the treatise, which is a false proposition. So when either Hume or Heimsen utter 4a, the propositions they express are different. Hume expresses the Russellian proposition which contains Hume and the property of being the author of the treatise, and Heimsen expresses the Russellian proposition containing Heimsen and the property of being the author of the treatise. So there's different propositions expressed by either of these sentences. However, because they are saying the same words, those two sentences have the same roles. So for each of Hume and Heimsen, the word I has the same role, i.e., the idea that an utterance of the word I picks out the speaker. So Hume and Heimsen, when they each utter 4a, are grasping different propositions, but under the same way of apprehending a proposition. So there's a sense in which both Hume and Heimsen are having the same thought. Both are thinking something along the lines of the speaker is the author of the treatise. However, because there are different speakers, there are different propositions. So there is the same role or same way of apprehending a thought, which Hume and Heimsen are employing when they say 4a. However, there's different propositions which they're apprehending under that way of apprehending a thought. Now, I want you to consider if Heimsen perhaps isn't crazy, and Heimsen says 4b, David Hume is the author of the treatise. Now, I want you to consider when Heimsen says 4b and compare that to when Hume says 4a. So Hume says, I am the author of the treatise. And Hyamson says David Hume is the author of the treatise. Now, as I just talked about, when Hume says, I'm the author of the treatise, there is a Russellian proposition he expresses, which contains himself, Hume, and the property of being the author of the treatise. Now, when Hyamson says for B, David Hume is the author of the treatise, he's also expressing that same proposition, because we can assume that David Hume contributes the referent David Hume to the Russellian proposition expressed. So when Hyamson says David Hume is the author of the treatise, he is expressing the same proposition as Hume does when Hume says for A. However, Hyamson is apprehending that same proposition in a different way, because he is using the role of different words, because the sentence for A contains different word than the sentence for B contains a different word than the sentence for A. So for B and for A, if for A is uttered by Hume and for B is uttered by anyone else, they are different ways of apprehending the same Russellian proposition. And those different ways accord to the dictionary meaning or the role of the words of those sentences. So here's an important passage from Perry's paper which provides a further example of this point about distinguishing ways of apprehending propositions and propositions themselves. And furthermore, this illustrates how there can be two different ways of apprehending the same proposition, or the same way of apprehending of different propositions. So Perry writes as follows. We use senses, and as I mentioned earlier, when Perry talks about sense, he means what plays a role of explaining or helping to explain cognitive value. So keep that interpretation of the word sense in mind when I read this paragraph. So Perry says, we use senses to individuate psychological states in explaining and predicting action. It is a sense entertained and not the thought apprehended that is tied to human action. When you and I entertain the sense of a bear is about to attack me, we behave similarly. We both roll up in a ball and try to be as still as possible. That the role of the sentence, a bear is about to attack me, is the same when two people utter it. So, this is because the role of the word me, which is the same as the role of the word I, since it's essentially the same word, it's just simply a rule that says a token of this word me picks out the speaker of the token, or in the context. Okay? So the sentence, a bear is about to attack me, has a certain role or cognitive value, which can be glossed as a bear is about to attack the person speaking. And the idea is that if I say this sentence and if you say this sentence, it's the same role that we both apprehend, or it's the same role that is a way of apprehending a certain Russellian proposition. And because it's the same role, it's the same kind of way of apprehending a proposition as a bear is about to attack the person speaking, we're both going to behave similarly. We're both going to run away or try to escape or survive this bear. However, when I say the sentence, a bear is about to attack me, I express the Russellian proposition that contains me, myself, which is a referent of the particular token of me. And this Russellian proposition will also contain the property of being about to be attacked by a bear. So when I say a bear is about to attack me, I express a Russellian proposition containing myself. Whereas when you say the sentence, a bear is about to attack me, you express a different Russellian proposition, which is one containing you and the property of being being about to be attacked by a bear. So when you and I say this sentence, we express different Russellian propositions. However, when you and I say this sentence, we apprehend those different propositions in the same way as that same way of apprehending is thinking the person speaking is about to be attacked by a bear. So Perry says about this case, different thoughts apprehended. So to recall, Perry uses the word thought to talk about the aspect of meaning that determines truth value. So here, in order to vindicate direct reference theory, we're assuming that a thought is a Russellian proposition. So when two different people say this sentence, there are different thoughts apprehended, so different Russellian propositions apprehended, but it's the same sense entertained. So they're thinking about these different propositions under the same role, or under the same way of apprehending a proposition. And for that reason, Perry says, there's the same behavior, because sense or cognitive value is tied to explaining action. Now, in a contrasting case, Perry explains as follows. When you and I both apprehend the thought that I am about to be attacked by a bear, we behave differently. I roll up in a ball, you run to get help. Same thought apprehended, different sense entertained, different behavior. So the idea is that the Russellian proposition that I am about to be attacked by a bear, the one that contains me, can be grasped by me under the role of the speaker is about to be attacked by a bear. Okay? But it could also be entertained by you. That same Russellian proposition, that same thought, could be entertained by you as something like, Rory is about to be attacked by a bear, or the person I'm looking at is about to be attacked by a bear. And when you apprehend that Russellian proposition under that different sense or that different role or that different way of apprehending the proposition, then you're not going to act the same way as me, because you will realize that it's me who's about to be attacked by a bear and not you. Okay? So there can be the same thought apprehended, but under different ways of apprehending thoughts. Now, this idea that cognitive value or senses is tied to explaining and predicting action we've already seen a little bit of that when looking at Campbell's work last week, because Campbell thought that cognitive value was a part of the inferences we make. And if you think that inferences are a kind of action, then we're in the same kind of ballpark here. So the cognitive value of our expressions explains the actions we make as well as the inferences. And in a couple of days, when I talk about Fodor's work, we'll see this idea of how we go about explaining action and inference in much more detail. Now, the final thing which I'd like to ask you to reflect upon as an exercise, and this might be relevant for one of the long paper topics, is one thing you can reflect on is whether understanding cognitive value as based on standing linguistic meaning, or the role of indexicals or demonstratives as word types, whether using this idea of role to understand cognitive value, as Perry suggests, whether that actually explains all Frege puzzles, or whether that is actually a satisfying account of what Frege was trying to get at with his notion of cognitive value. And you can begin reviewing, or you can begin reflecting on this by reviewing pages 495 to 496 of Perry's paper.